A teenage girl in a church I served in Kentucky many years ago evolved very quickly from being a very quiet and shy but low performing student into a raging, violent, antisocial drug dealer wannabe. Her parents were good friends, and I tried to be as helpful as possible. But it became clear that when she was forced to come to counseling appointments with me, that she would just sit in my office and lie to my face. She would just tell me anything that she thought I wanted to hear that could get her out of my study a little faster. She ran away from home one night, and her father and I set up watch in a car in the parking lot of a large apartment complex where we thought she had been buying drugs in hopes of finding her. Late at night, we did spot her moving from one apartment to another, and my friend and I jumped out and gave chase. And in those days, I was a pretty fast runner, and so I caught up with her first just as she was entering an apartment with me close behind. And it was a long time ago, but I can still see it. It was a nightmare scenario with men and women lying about on dirty mattresses on the floor, hypodermic needles littering the filth, and a lot of very high and very confused looking addicts were staring up at the tall man in the black suit. Before they could figure out that I was a preacher and not a detective, I grabbed my young parishioner by the arm and led her out of the apartment. We felt that there was no other option to save her life other than to have her admitted to a mental hospital. And I had a connection there with an absolutely amazing psychiatrist who at least seemed to me to have almost magical powers in psychology. The psychiatrist and I held sessions with her jointly, daily, during her hospitalization. Dr. O'Connor saw through her constant lying immediately, and he said something to her that has stuck with me for 40 years. He said to her, "Every time you lie, you fade a little bit. If you keep lying all of the time, you will eventually become invisible. You will have erased yourself from the world of anyone you have ever cared about." This realization seemed to impress her for a little while. But folks, these stories don't all have happy endings. After a month of hospitalization, she returned home, and in a few weeks she ran away again, and this time for good. The last I heard about her was she was working in a very run-down strip club in order to keep her supply of drugs. Her grief-stricken mother over the next few years drank herself to death, and her father spent about 2 years unemployed and sitting and staring into the distance. He did eventually get his act together well enough to go back to work, and I was honored a couple of years later to go back to Louisville to officiate at his marriage to a wonderful woman who helped to pull him out of the black hole of despair where he had been living for way too long. But his daughter succeeded in basically erasing her existence, and I honestly have very little hope that she is alive today. Honesty, truth-telling, used to be a treasured virtue. Lying, on the other hand, was associated with criminals and con men, addicts, and philanderers. Now, lying by politicians, the news media, especially the news media that is clearly more about entertainment than information, but businesses, corporations, and even individuals, lying has become so common that I'm no longer certain that honesty is regarded seriously as a matter of character, that there's an expectation that what you say can be believed. With your permission, I'd like to spend a few minutes just trying to rescue truth-telling from the trash heap of our current society. And forgive me in advance for getting into the weeds a little bit, but I want to distinguish between compulsive liars and pathological liars. I think we use the term compulsive liar inappropriately, because a compulsion, like obsessive compulsive disorder, a compulsive liar will tell lies, will fabricate statements just because they feel a need to lie. It's sort of like other compulsions, like avoiding stepping on cracks or locking and unlocking your door 3 or 4 times before believing that it's locked. And if you've ever had a kid or a close friend with ADHD, you probably notice that they are generally pretty unreliable in the stories that they tell you. They're not con artists, they're not trying to manipulate you, they're not trying to trick you. They just seem to feel a need to lie. A compulsive gambler feels a need to gamble. It's like that. They just feel normal when they are telling a lie. A pathological liar is a horse of a different color altogether. Pathological liars lie to get what they want, to control the behavior of other people. They are manipulative, typically narcissists, and their pathology makes them indifferent to what their lies actually do to other people. Pathological liars are often really good at lying. They're persuasive. And in the case of a malignant narcissist, once they've told the lie 4 or 5 times, it at least seems that they have actually come to believe it themselves, often to such a degree that they can't even remember what was true in the first place. We know by the testimony of people who were around him that there was a point at which Donald Trump knew that he had lost the 2020 election, but he has then lied about that election so many times. I wouldn't be surprised if he actually believes that it was rigged and he won. Addicts are almost always pathological liars because they have to lie to cover for their illegal drug use, their drunk driving, their theft of their spouses or their parents' checkbooks or credit cards, the irresponsible use of family resources, and the bad credit they create, all of which is a part of maintaining their steady supply of their drug of choice. In AA and Al-Anon, the family members of addicts are encouraged to not believe the lies. Stop believing the lies. Because if you act like you believe the lies, if you are gullible, that only encourages more of the same lying behavior. But as I said, pathological liars are, well, they're practiced. They're good at it. When I have had an addict in counseling, I quickly get to the point where I could spend all of my time trying to get enough information out of them to figure out if they're lying right now or if this happens to be one of the rare occasions when they were telling me the truth. So you tend to assume that they're just always lying. And that goes back to what Dr. O'Connor said about becoming increasingly invisible every time you tell a lie. A constant liar is someone that you either consciously or unconsciously, you just stop listening to them because it isn't worth the energy to try to figure out if what they're saying now is also a lie or if it might accidentally happen to be true. For example, the hosts of Morning Joe, Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, eventually decided that they would no longer allow the Trump administration spokesperson, Kellyanne Conway, to come on their show because you couldn't believe anything she was saying. Just a year into the Trump administration, they realized that if they actually tried to do fact-checking on what she says when she's talking so fast, that it would eat up the entire show. She continued to be interviewed on Fox and other entirely unreliable news sources, but she was contributing to the increasing disappearance of her credibility and the increasing disappearance of the credibility of anyone who was associated with her, because most of the time what came out of her mouth was what she called alternative facts. We saw this in the recent hush money trial of Donald Trump, in which a key witness, Michael Cohen, a former Trump attorney, had lied so often to cover up for Trump's crimes and illicit affairs that the Trump defense team kept insisting to the jury that they couldn't believe anything Cohen said. And to a certain extent, they were right. Cohen had erased himself to the point that he had already lost his law license. He had spent time in prison. And in this trial, he wanted to tell the truth, but his reputation was so damaged that the prosecutors had to find other witnesses who could corroborate absolutely everything he said, lest the jury just dismiss it out of hand out of extremely reasonable skepticism. Michael was a true pathological liar. Most of the lies discussed in this trial were lies he had told for Donald Trump. But Michael Cohen had told a lot of other lies about his own taxes and other issues in his own life, feathering his own nest. He was an accomplished and seasoned liar. Now he would like to redeem himself, and I don't blame him. He'd like to reclaim some credibility, at least to restore his standing in the eyes of his own children and his wife. So he wants us to believe him when he apologizes for his past and insists that he can become a new person. It's just that the only thing that can restore trust when someone has erased their own soul, when they have become invisible, is to tell the truth all the time, so that day after day, no matter what they say, you increasingly can believe that it's true. Unfortunately, narcissistic pathological liars usually want a brand new soul instantaneously. I've always said to the families of addicts that for the addict, time is not linear. What happened yesterday virtually doesn't exist. If they've decided to turn over a new leaf, then they want you to give them full trust and credibility on day one. But the hard truth is that rebuilding a reputation is one of the hardest things anyone can ever set out to do. If you've ever been married to or in love with an addict or an alcoholic, you know what it's like to desperately want to believe the lies. Confronting the lies makes you seem like you were an idiot for having a relationship with them. It's embarrassing. And so you want to believe the lies. You want to believe that this is the last time that this will ever happen. There'll never be another drunken disappearance for a night or two or three. There will never be another affair. There'll never be another argument that becomes domestic violence. I suspect that every therapist in the world has had to often remind one client after another of this basic fact, that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. When I was first divorced in my mid-30s, I dated a beautiful young woman she was a part of my running group and a part of my biking group. We had a lot of common interests and many common views and beliefs. And I can say that she was the most generous, loving, kind, and fun person in the world on one day. And then the next day, for no discernible reason, she would be the meanest, most critical, hateful, resentful person you have ever met. Several months into the relationship, it was no longer having a good day followed by a bad day, but rather the moods would shift from one to the other, sometimes in a matter of minutes, in the midst of a single conversation. You could go from the good person to the scary person immediately. We saw a couple of different counselors together. We tried everything to try to smooth out the good and the bad times, but I can tell you that nothing worked. I loved the angelic side of her. I wanted to marry that person, but I was terrified of the demonic side. And if a minister can't believe that a person is capable of changing, then why be a minister at all? But a psychologist friend saw that I was literally tearing myself apart trying to make that relationship work. And she sat me down and looked me in the face and just repeated over and over, the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. I desperately did not want it to be true. But folks, of whatever truths you can find in psychology, that's got to be truth number one. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. That doesn't mean that a person cannot change, but when the issue is a profound character flaw, that person has to want to change. They have to want to change more than anything in the world. But in her case, what she really wanted was just another victim. And even after all these years, I sincerely believe that she really wanted to change, that she really wanted to have a stable, long-term love relationship. She just didn't want it badly enough to own her behavior and to work at changing it. That's largely why I have eventually stopped working with alcoholics and addicts. I'm sympathetic with the plight and I want them to do well. I just seem to find in my own practice that whenever I was working with an alcoholic, I ended up wanting their sobriety more than they did. And in some magical sleight of hand, I ended up becoming responsible for their sobriety, which of course is something that absolutely never works. That's why in AA and NA meetings, you always start those meetings by going around the room and everyone introduces themselves by their first name and says, I'm an alcoholic or I'm an addict. Some people just can't bring themselves to say it. I've seen people get up and walk out of meetings because they just couldn't say it. And most of the people there have to say it 5 or 6 times a week for a couple of years before they even start to believe that it's true. One of the most strangely ironic cases of lying in our public conversation recently was the conviction of Hunter Biden in federal court. While he was actively a crack addict, he got the wild idea that he wanted to buy a handgun. The form he had to fill out to buy that gun asked the question, are you currently addicted to drugs? And like every other addict you've ever met, he easily and impulsively lied, insisting that he was not. So for 11, count them, 11 whole days, Hunter Biden owned a gun. The gun was never loaded, it was never fired, and his girlfriend finally just snatched it and threw it in a garbage dumpster. Now, folks, just looking around the United States, we have more than 400 million guns in the United States. We also have between 40 and 50 million alcoholics and drug addicts in the United States. Now, how many of those 50 million addicts own at least one or two of this country's share of 400 million guns? I've spent most of my life in Kentucky and Tennessee and Missouri and now Florida, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say that just about all of the addicts own 1 or 2 guns at least and have owned them for a lot more than 11 days. Hunter Biden may, ironically, be one of the least guilty gun-owning addicts in the country, and yet he was put on trial and found guilty of these federal charges, charges that have never, ever in the history of our country been brought against an addict who had not committed a crime with the gun. In my opinion, the person who just decided to ask addicts if they were using drugs is the person who should have been on trial here. If we don't want addicts to be able to buy a gun, then the purchaser should have to pee in a cup before making the purchase. The sad truth is that the gun industry doesn't want to wait for test results, and they don't even want to screen out potential buyers. They want to sell as many guns as possible. So that form where you ask people to self-report whether they're using illegal drugs in an addictive way, they know they're going to lie, and that's what they expect because they don't want anything to slow down gun sales. If you want to know if someone is an addict, you don't ask them. You ask their spouse or their kids or their employer, or probably even their neighbors. But the one person you're not going to get an honest answer from is the addict. The hypocrisy in this case has been maddening, but the day of the trial, when the verdict was read, the talking heads on television news went straight to the point that his conviction proves that the judicial system has not been weaponized by Democrats against Republicans. So what? We just sacrifice Hunter Biden on the altar of trying to appease hypocrites who will not be appeased by anything? No. The obvious truth is that Trump has been shown every kind of favoritism imaginable in his multiple cases, all of the way from the little federal court just south of me here in Florida, where the judge has made sure that Trump will not go on trial for stealing nuclear secrets and battle plans and classified documents before the November election, all of the way up to the Supreme Court, which is still sitting on a decision about whether a president is immune from any criminal prosecution, so that he won't go on trial for the insurrection he caused before the November election. Trump has been out of office now for over 3 years, and the judicial system looks like it's still just his fat little lapdog, while many people in the rest of the world suffer from abusive prosecution for petty or non-existent crimes. The judicial system is rigged. I've been saying that for years. It's just that it is ludicrously rigged in favor of our criminal in chief, the former and possibly future President of the United States. What I don't understand is why lying has not made him invisible. It seems to work on almost everyone else, but somehow this cult leader can spew the most obvious lies all day long, and his loyal following will deny what they have seen with their own eyes and heard with their own ears, and insist that this tyrant has never lied. I have no explanation with which to assuage the cognitive dissonance that I know that we are all feeling. But I'm sure of this. Hunter Biden's guilty verdict for a crime that would never have been charged against anyone whose last name wasn't Biden is evidence that somewhere in the distant back of Republican brains is an awareness that lying is wrong and honesty is a virtue, and we should cherish and strive to become more honest ourselves. Trump's daily spewing of propaganda, disinformation, lies, and self-serving exaggerations have somehow not made him disappear, but association with him seems to make a lot of other people disappear. 8 of his staff members and administration members have already served time in prison. 3 more have been criminally charged and almost certainly will serve time in prison. And even though Trump still manages to ride a wave of incomprehensible popularity, which one of us would ever hire one of his sons or one of his daughters to fill a responsible position in any kind of business? Honestly, would you hire Eric Trump to manage a shoe store at the mall? I wouldn't. Who would want to be friends with Kellyanne Conway or any of the people who have constantly repeated his lies, lied for him, and pretended that he was not guilty of multiple absolutely disgusting crimes? Trump has not become invisible, but I would contend that the Republican Party has. The Republican Party has lost all credibility because of their ongoing association with him and their loyalty to his anti-democratic and clearly fascist propaganda. What would it take for the Republican Party to become a trustworthy and reliable political influence again, beyond holding several funerals? I don't know, but the price is going to be high. Now, people can change, and parties can change course, but the recovery of honor, trust, reliability is a long road, and I contend that it is paved with honesty. Rejecting half-truths, gross exaggerations, and absurd conspiracy theories and deceptive propaganda. A whole lot of people are going to have to say a whole lot of true things to become visible again in the world, where character really does matter. As you would learn if you went to Al-Anon, I beg you to stop believing the lies, and I implore you to make lying wrong again.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.